Have you ever felt that subtle prickle? The thought that someone somewhere might be watching. It's a feeling that's become, well, incredibly pervasive in our hyperconnected world. Today, we're plunging into a deep dive on surveillance, that systematic monitoring of behavior, activities, or information, all aimed really at gathering data, influencing us, managing things, or directing behavior. It's enduring and, frankly, increasingly hard to escape.
And right at the very heart of this, you find this profound ethical tightrope we're walking. It's that delicate, often pretty precarious balance between our collective security and, well, our individual autonomy, between the exercise of power and the preservation of privacy. And as these technologies evolve, I mean, breathtaking speed, right? So too do the complex dilemmas they throw up, legal, social, philosophical, the
Right.
works.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to take you on a bit of a journey. We'll start with the ancient origins of watching, move through these incredible technological leaps, then look at the legal frameworks, and finally, really grapple with those thorny ethical questions that define surveillance today. It's all about helping you understand what truly matters most in this incredibly complex, yet, let's face it, deeply personal topic. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start by tracing those deep roots of watching, long before cameras or even electricity existed. We're talking ancient civilizations here. Egypt, Rome, China. They weren't using satellites, obviously, but they had these really intricate networks, informants, state records, all to maintain control. And what's truly fascinating is how tied up these early forms were with religious and moral oversight. You had community elders, religious figures, even this idea of divine watchfulness.
Yeah.
All serving to enforce social norms. It wasn't just top-down state power. Often it was about the community keeping tabs on itself.
Precisely. And in feudal societies, for example, the surveillance by lords and clergy, it wasn't subtle at all. It was a very visible part of maintaining social order, ensuring compliance. These early practices were quite overt, really rooted in visible authority. And they sort of laid the conceptual groundwork for the more systematic monitoring that came later.
And what a shift that was. You fast forward to the early modern and industrial ages, and the scale just explodes. We see the rise of these big centralized state bureaucracies, the advent of census taking. Suddenly, governments could collect, store, analyze huge quantities of information about their populations. But how did that shift from sort of visible local monitoring to this large-scale, often unseen data collection?
Yeah.
How did that really reshape the relationship between the state and citizens?
Well, that's where Jeremy Bentham's panopticon becomes such a potent symbol, right? This theoretical prison design, a single guard observing everyone without being seen. The real insight, though, isn't just prisons, it's how this concept showed a new logic of surveillance. Constant, invisible observation as a tool for discipline, for control. Michel Foucault, in Discipline and Punish, just brilliantly showed how this idea got embedded in the fabric of modern society, shaping institutions from schools and hospitals to factories and, yes, prisons. This period really marks the institutionalization of surveillance. You get police forces, ID systems, intelligence agencies becoming core state functions.
Then the 20th century saw surveillance expand to, well, unprecedented, often terrifying levels. Under totalitarian regimes, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, East Germany's Stasi surveillance became synonymous with state terror. Repression, systematic violation of human rights. It was a weapon, pure and simple, used to crush dissent and keep absolute control.
But what's critical to understand, though, is that this wasn't just authoritarian states. Democracies, too, engaged in pretty extensive intelligence operations, especially during the Cold War. Think about the FBI, CIA in the US, MI5 in the UK. They conducted significant surveillance, all in the name of national security. So that highlights this universal tension, doesn't it? The appeal of surveillance for security, even in societies that claim to value freedom.
And here's where it gets really interesting. It kind of starts laying the groundwork for today. This era also introduced the dual potential of mass media. On one hand, yeah, it enabled top-down surveillance by authorities monitoring broadcasts, things like that. But crucially, it also paved the way for bottom-up scrutiny by the public, right? Journalists, citizens started to monitor those in power. How did this early media scrutiny start to foreshadow the kind of, reciprocal, citizen-led surveillance we see everywhere now?
That's a really crucial pivot point. Because the digitization of data, the sheer proliferation of databases, it fundamentally transformed the scope, the very nature of surveillance. Suddenly, it was possible to monitor individuals, whole populations, at a scale and with a granularity that was just unimaginable before, creating these vast, searchable repositories of behavioral information, things that simply weren't feasible previously.
And the internet, wow. It quickly became the ultimate surveillance tool, didn't it?
Mhm.
Internet service providers, search engines, even those tiny little cookies, tracking user activities across every digital space you visit. Just think about it. Every click, every search, every single interaction online becomes a data point. But is this just about companies knowing what we like, or does it go deeper? What new capabilities did this unlock beyond just commercial stuff?
That's a critical distinction to make because while it started commercially, it really opened the door for advanced tech like AI, machine learning to analyze these massive data sets. And this enables things like predictive policing, trying to forecast crime before it happens, or facial recognition, even emotion detection. Now, these promise greater efficiency, sure, but they raise these profound questions about bias baked into the algorithms, about transparency, how are decisions made, and accountability when things inevitably go wrong. We also see widespread biometric surveillance, fingerprints, iris scans, DNA profiling blurring the line between simple ID and really deep intrusion. And of course, geolocation, GPS tracking, thanks to our phones, our cars, real-time movement monitoring, eroding our spatial privacy bit by bit.
Which brings us neatly to this paradigm shift that affects every single one of us, the age of surveillance capitalism. The real insight here isn't just that our data is being sold, it's how major tech companies, Google, Facebook, Amazon, build their entire business models on it, on extracting, analyzing, and then using our behavioral data. Not just to predict, but to subtly manufacture our desires, blurring the lines between our own choices and what algorithms push us towards.
And that's exactly right. These sophisticated algorithms are used to predict and, crucially, influence user behavior, shaping everything from what we buy to potentially our political views. What's fascinating here, and a bit scary, is the increasing porosity, the blurring between public and private sector surveillance. Governments are leveraging corporate data for law enforcement, for intelligence, and corporations. They benefit from regulatory gaps. It's created this complex ecosystem where power is kind of diffuse, accountability is often murky, and individuals. We're left with surprisingly little control over our own information.
So if we get right to the heart of the debate, it really boils down to the right to privacy. Philosophically, privacy is grounded in these core principles: individual autonomy, dignity, consent. It's seen as absolutely essential for our self-development, for exercising freedom, for maintaining trust in our relationships. But how do we even begin to philosophically weigh the benefits that some argue surveillance provides against these fundamental individual rights? It seems like apples and oranges sometimes.
Well, philosophically, we often grapple with two big frameworks. There's the utilitarian view, right? Does the greater good maybe enhance security, crime prevention? Does that outweigh the cost to privacy, personal freedom, social trust? Or, on the other hand, you have the deontological view. This emphasizes that some rights, like privacy, might just be fundamentally inviolable. Certain kinds of surveillance could be inherently wrong, regardless of the supposed benefits, and these two perspectives are constantly clashing.
And legal frameworks are, I guess, society's attempt to mediate these tensions in practice. You have international norms like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They affirm privacy as a fundamental human right.
Yes, and then we see national laws trying to regulate this. You mentioned some key ones. The EU's GDPR, for instance, which has set a kind of global standard for handling personal data. In the US, you have things like HIPAA for health info, FISA for foreign intelligence surveillance. India's AEHAR system is another unique example, a huge biometric ID program. However, the problem is these laws, despite their intentions, are often undermined by loopholes, by weak enforcement, or simply by technology moving way too fast for the law to keep up.
And the social, the psychological impacts of all this pervasive surveillance, they're really far-reaching, often quite insidious. Think about the chilling effect. We hear that term a lot. This is where the knowledge, or even just the suspicion that you're being watched, can lead you to self-censor, maybe avoid controversial topics online, or even just withdraw from public discussion altogether. It's not just theoretical. I think many of us have probably felt that little hesitation, right?
Oh, absolutely. And unfortunately, surveillance practices often make existing inequalities worse. Marginalized communities frequently find themselves disproportionately targeted through things like racial profiling, suppression of protests, or algorithmic bias. That's where the algorithms themselves may be trained on biased data, unfairly flag certain groups. And a really significant consequence of all this monitoring is the erosion of trust. Trust in institutions, trust in technology, even trust in our interpersonal relationships as people become warier and warier about how their data is collected, used, and maybe misused.
Now, government surveillance presents its own distinct ethical challenges, and it really depends heavily on the political context, doesn't it? In democratic societies, the main challenge is balancing national security needs with protecting civil liberties. Ideally, you have robust oversight mechanisms, but then you look at authoritarian regimes, and their surveillance is very clearly, very openly, a tool of oppression. How do these two approaches actually play out differently on the ground?
Indeed. In democracies, you theoretically have oversight mechanisms, courts, legislators, watchdog groups designed to ensure transparency, accountability. Yet their effectiveness is often limited, maybe by secrecy, by the sheer complexity and expanding scope of intelligence operations, especially when emergency powers come into play. In authoritarian regimes, though, it's different. Mass surveillance infrastructures, like China's social credit system, enable really comprehensive monitoring and control of citizens. We're talking predictive policing, digital censorship to stifle dissent, maintain power. And what's particularly concerning is that these tools, this expertise, are often exported to other governments, spreading their reach globally.
And yeah, this isn't just a national issue anymore. It's truly global. Alliances like the Five Eyes, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they facilitate cross-border intelligence sharing,
Right.
which contributes to a kind of surveillance arms race, really fueled by advances in AI, maybe quantum computing down the line.
Quantum computing, yes, which could break current encryption.
Right.
Yeah.
And cyber espionage. There's this clear entanglement of military and corporate interests driving it all.
And looking ahead, the future of surveillance is being shaped by emerging technologies that bring entirely new dilemmas to the table. Consider neural surveillance. This is enabled by brain-computer interfaces, collecting neurodata, actual information directly from our brains. That raises unprecedented questions about cognitive privacy, the very boundaries of our thoughts, our selfhood. Then you have the spread of smart cities, the Internet of Things, IoT, where everyday objects are connected, creating environments of almost continuous observation, where public and private data streams just merge seamlessly. And synthetic media, deepfakes, they introduce new threats and opportunities. Manipulated content can be a tool of surveillance, but also a means of evasion or deception. It cuts both ways.
It gets even more speculative, maybe even a bit sci-fi, when you think about scenarios like predictive governance, where surveillance is used to preempt behaviors before they even occur. That really challenges fundamental principles of justice, doesn't it? Due process, individual moral responsibility. I mean, if a system predicts you might commit a crime, does that justify intervention before you've actually done anything?
And we face this creeping normalization of a post-privacy society, where constant observation is just accepted, maybe even embraced, which raises profound questions about the future of freedom, autonomy, democracy itself. This raises an important question. How do we prevent algorithmic bias and automated injustice from just perpetuating, maybe even amplifying, existing social inequalities? Especially when the decisions are made by these complex systems we often can't fully understand or easily challenge?
Okay, so despite these, frankly, quite formidable challenges, there are pathways toward a more ethical future. That's where resistance and reform come in. Think about encryption technologies, privacy tools like Signal, Tor, and things like zero-knowledge proofs, these cryptographic methods allowing you to prove something without revealing the underlying info. Pretty clever stuff. These tools empower individuals, give them some agency back to protect their data and communications from unwanted surveillance.
Exactly. And alongside the tech, we're seeing growing movements for data sovereignty, for citizen pushback. Think about GDPR lawsuits challenging corporate practices, whistleblowing exposing government overreach, grassroots activism demanding change. These efforts directly challenge the sort of unchecked expansion of surveillance and demand greater transparency, accountability, and ultimately control for individuals. There's also techno-ethical activism people working to design ethical algorithms, promote transparency, build digital rights coalitions, all aiming to reshape the tech landscape so it aligns better with democratic values and human rights.
So, as we bring this deep dive to a close, it seems pretty clear that the history and the present of surveillance is this continuous evolution, marked by these constantly shifting balances. Safety versus freedom, order versus autonomy, control versus consent.
Absolutely. The current state reflects both the immense promise of technology, but also the very real perils of unchecked power. It has profound implications for us as individuals, for our societies, and for the future of democracy. So what does all this mean for you listening? Well, navigating this ethical tightrope, this balance between collective security and individual rights, it requires ongoing multidisciplinary dialogue. It needs stronger governance, better regulations, and crucially, the development and deployment of technologies that are actually aligned with ethical principles from the start.
Yeah, the future of surveillance, it isn't set in stone. It's not predetermined. It will be shaped by public engagement, by democratic decision-making, and by our collective will, hopefully, to uphold values like privacy, dignity, and justice. So we hope this deep dive encourages your continued vigilance, critical reflection, and maybe even active participation to help ensure that surveillance, where it exists, serves the common good without sacrificing those fundamental rights we all cherish.